Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 5 of our study, which covers the Book of Genesis, chapter 5, verse 1, through chapter 6, verse 10. This section is a bit of a transition point. So we've gotten creation and first parents, first parents and being first parents, and some original sin stuff, and we've got some of that far distant myth out of the way, and that's so important, right? But if you know the stories that come in the book of Genesis, the ones we tend to think about, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's a very different kind of thing than how the book starts. And that necessitates a bit of a narrative transition, which happens not quite yet, but we're building toward that. The hinge point is we've got Noah and Abraham, and Noah's kind of the last of this style that we've been in, and then we fairly quickly transition to what becomes the new style. And this part here then is kind of getting us toward Noah, from Adam and Eve and Seth, and past the Cain and Abel thing. Done with that, now we've got Seth. From there toward Noah is where we go here in this lesson, which makes this not filler, it matters, but filler adjacent. As we're getting from one key character, Adam and Eve, to the next, Noah. In especially the first 5 books of the Bible, when you're kind of skipping some generations and going from key character to key character, you tend to do that by way of some genealogies that show you a summary view of what you're skipping over. And there's a tree that illustrates some of that in the lesson on page 29. If you want to get the visual summary of what the text talks about, we'll go through it as well. We're not going to overly dwell on these genealogies because they're meant to just show things are continuing, right? The part that the text thinks are important is going to pull out and make additional comments on, other than so-and-so became the father of so-and-so. And we will highlight those things when they happen. And there are a few buried in this. You've got to watch these genealogies because there's occasionally something really interesting kind of in the middle, and it's usually like a throwaway sentence, like we'll see with Enoch. That's just sort of this guy, plus sentence, this guy, and like right in there, that sentence can be a big deal. So worth reading and paying attention to these, but generally you are going from point A, Seth, to point B, Noah. And we'll see that device used elsewhere. It's used a lot in the Old Testament and still in Genesis, so we're going to see some of that. Other things worth commenting on here. We are still in the way the text is approaching this. We're still kind of in almost an age of myth, right? This is from the point of view of where people are actually writing this down. This is stuff a long time ago, and it's not an attempt to do history, right? And there are old stories that are trying to be reconciled. And one of those has to do with some legendary heroes, right? That are like so strong and big and powerful and mighty and all of that. Think like Achilles, right? Who is related to and has interactions with the gods and is this larger than life mighty warrior figure that you have a whole mythic story about. You have that sort of background and history floating around for these people as well. And so you end up getting a reference to and some mention of some of that pulled into the story, this story, to explain some of their other stories. So the two really big, interesting kind of myth adjacent points we get that we'll talk more about as we get to them through here are the existence of those people and what's the deal with Enoch, which is really interesting. And I guess the third part would be how long people are living. The people who want to take this fairly literally say death was new to people, and so they tended to live longer because, less corruption, whatever. I don't think that theologically tracks very well. Like, sin is sin and death is death. It doesn't get worse over time in how it affects all of humanity. We're going to see, one of the key takeaways at the end of this lesson is it's so bad already, God's wondering if he should, scrap the whole project. So it's not something that, is necessarily that progressive. So that's an idea floating around out there. Take it or leave it. Personally, I think the ages of these people are just more of that myth and legend coming in, and are a thing that probably shouldn't be taken literally. The core idea, however, of that lineage and the people that we're tracing, that is very important theologically, right? So do we care that Methuselah was 969 years old or whatever? No. Do we care that he represents one person in this line that started with Adam, that leads through him to Noah, that leads through Noah to Abram, that leads through Abram to Jacob, that ultimately leads from Jacob to Jesus? Yes, we care tremendously about that. It is possible within the Bible, and two different evangelists do it, to trace that lineage from varying degrees of close to the beginning all the way to Jesus. That's important. And there's a point about it goes not just back to Adam, but to God, right? God created Adam in his image and likeness. That's essential to, as we talked at length about, to what it means to be a human being. We see that from Adam to Seth is passed likeness to Adam, which is Seth is in the image and likeness of Adam, which is no longer in the likeness to God, but does have that potential to be like God. And so you have through this line something essential being passed, that is that original intention and character of humanity, broken as it is still who and what we could be, matters greatly. And so we trace this lineage because from Adam to Seth to Jesus is this essential component to what it is to be human. And eventually somebody is what humanity was meant to be, and is that way in this line. And that's Jesus. And through him, all of us can also be what it means to be human. And lots of other lessons in that along the way that, not this part of the story, we'll get to. And probably the most interesting development of that before Jesus comes in the form of Jacob, and we'll get to it in this book and in this study. So that'll be a thing to watch for as well. So this lesson is also setting up with these genealogies that there are parts we don't care about. What happens to Adam's other children? What happens to any of these people's other children along the way? We don't care. There's going to be the one path that we care about. And as we keep showing the tree, a tree getting, goes out from the trunk and has all these branches. We keep showing the branches, but we only care about the trunk, right? And we keep zooming in on parts of the tree when we look at it, and everything that branches stops mattering. So here we establish, kind of for the first time, really clearly that we're going to start dropping branches and not caring, and that sets up the very important theological idea that one of these branches is the one that matters and the one that we trace the story through. So that's kind of our key point here, is that, and we're going to get into some of the setup for Noah and the events around Noah's life as well, which will be kind of, how's it going with this humanity project? And that's our bridge point here that'll get us into the next major event in the form of Noah. Here, because what we're doing is genealogy instead of more story, we restate the start of the root and base of our tree, right? Which is God created man. In this case, man is Adam and Eve. So it's the human sense of man and not the male sense of man. Although the genealogies do go through the male line, and the fathers are the ones who get mentioned. It's still, humanity is male and female. He created them. When we look at man in this sense, like, we're talking about the history of all people. Who do we have then? We have Adam, that God created, and he became a father of a son in his own likeness after his image, and named him Seth. That is the language used earlier in the book to describe God's creation of Adam, right? In his likeness after his image, that's how God created Adam. And now Adam's son Seth has that. So we're not just talking about a genealogy in terms of listing children, right? We're listing this essential likeness is getting passed from God, who is not human, to Adam through an act of creation, to Seth through a different act of creation, but also an act of creation. We're not tracing just who had what kids. We're tracing that there's this thing about the creation of these kids from their parents that is preserving something that was unique to Adam in creation. And then we see in verse 4, and he, Adam, had other sons and daughters. We don't name those other sons and daughters. We named the first two, and then those are off the table. Then we had Seth. We named him, and we don't care about the other ones. We've already set up Adam and Eve's children are very important, but they're important until they're not. This is the thing that these genealogies are kind of setting up, and that is really, it's an essential and an important concept, right? The implication is that not every child has this essential human trait passed to them. There's something special about one. And it's not necessarily the firstborn, because the firstborn is not in the picture anymore. It's just one. And when you get to the one and where that's going to pass, then the rest become less important. And that becomes a high source of drama later when there's a son who's not the firstborn, who does fancy himself as more important. than the first, and takes steps accordingly, and kind of butts in on what might have been considered to be how that fate works. There can be just one, and it will be a point of very interesting contention. But for now, it's general, and generally, it's going to be like the oldest non-disqualified person. And it takes a bit to get disqualified. And it matters a lot every time it happens, which we'll get to more than once in this book. So we have set up, from the beginning here, God created first parents, and from them is passing some essential aspect of what it means to be human and created by God. That's a lot for a few verses that just look like Adam had some kids. And we know Adam eventually dies and gets attributed to his lifespan, a number of years that nobody could possibly live now. Talked about that in the intro, take or leave. Take that as you will. It seems like myth to me. And that's where we've started, and now we have a new person, Seth. As these things sometimes go, when you're setting up what you're going to do, it takes a little longer, you spend a little more time on it. Adam to Seth, that was worth quite a bit of comment and had some important things going on. Now we get all the way from Seth to Enoch, and essentially that's without incident, right? The key point is we care about one along the way, every step of the way. And anybody else who might be born, and there are others, we don't care about, just as we didn't with the other sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. We care about the one, and this passing through this genealogy is also fast forwarding through time, right? It's who matters. These guys don't. So we'll just say he became the father of this guy, who this one, right? We're going to do it with this question because the text is doing it. This is basically a fast forward to the next thing that's worth comment. This is where this gets a little tricky. Because you're reading along the genealogy and your eyes are glazing over, and it's this guy and sons and daughters and lived this long, and then this guy and sons and daughters and lived this long, and the names aren't that familiar, and you just think, and you just kind of, it's very easy to start to tune out, right? And this one follows that same pattern, exactly imperfectly, except there's one other sentence after the normal stuff that you would expect. Verse 24 jumps in and says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Whereas for everybody else it said, and he died. This one is, he was not, for God took him, and he walked with God. That is very dense theologically, crammed into one sentence in the middle of a genealogy. It's the prime example in all of the Bible of why sometimes you really need to pay attention to these things, because something can be thrown in. There is an idea in small t tradition that two people in the Old Testament never died. One is real flashy, gets taken up in a chariot of fire into heaven. And that everybody generally, most everybody has heard that story of Elijah, right? That's pretty well known. And you think, yeah, Elijah the prophet, big deal. He got taken up to heaven. Nobody like that. Nothing happened like that. Because he gets a fair bit of screen time through his life, and it's a big deal with the transition to his successor. And big story, big deal, huge climax. Major event in the Old Testament, of course, it's really noteworthy. So Elijah is in quite a unique territory there that he never died. Except he's not. And the other guy gets one line dwelling on it, but it's Enoch, who walked with God, which suggests that's what happened in the garden, right? Like, you had the garden and Adam and Eve, and that's what they did, right? That was before they were corrupted by sin and death. They walked in the garden with God. And when they turned away from God, they weren't allowed in the garden anymore, which means they also weren't walking with God. But that is a description of the state of humanity as it was still innocent and untainted by sin. And then, of course, they didn't die because they hadn't sinned. There's an implication of, Enoch walks with God. That's like pre-sin behavior. And then he doesn't die. That's what happens when you didn't sin. So Enoch is in this very unique category where you can't say he went to heaven. The small T tradition says, Jesus got down to hell, to harrow hell, and right there at the door, like right by heaven, but not able to go in on their own, were Elijah and Enoch. And Jesus said, "Oh, hey, pals, go on in," and then went and basically addressed everybody else, right? Like, obviously that's paraphrasing the tradition, but the idea is they're right at the gates, right? They still can't get into heaven without Jesus, but they aren't subject to the same kind of death and perdition that reigned over the rest of humanity, and are in a very close to unique space. It comes up no more because there are only two of them, and this is what we get about Enoch. So take it as you will. It's a fascinating thing to think about, though, that back then you have a model of someone, and it's what does a really close relationship with God back at this stage of humanity's development look like. We don't see anything he did, but he walked with God. And insofar as he did so, he did not die the same way that everybody else dies. If you want to add a third person to the list of people like that, who, again, not saved by her own actions and not able to enter heaven on her own, but someone who walks with God and does not know sin or death, then the pinnacle of that is, of course, our Blessed Mother as well, right? So she is unique and above Elijah and Enoch in a very special and grace way, right? So not entirely the same thing, but categorically, you've got these few people who, for whatever reason, have this relationship with God that is so advanced and their whole lives are so in sync with God that they're different from all of the rest of us for all time. And of course, Jesus, right? It's cheating to throw Jesus into that list because he is also God. But he is, of course, also as a human in that category as well. That was implied, but I definitely should say it. And originally Adam and Eve, right? And they show us how easy it is to be walking with God and not walk with God. So if you're Enoch and you make it 365 years, and then God says, yep, that which is young for all of these people. And then God says, yeah, let's go. And you can keep walking with me somewhere else and you'll just no more be here. He made it a long time. That's we don't know how long Adam and Eve were in the garden exactly. You can kind of back into it by Seth's age, but it's it's not really worth speculating on because it's all myth anyway. But Enoch did a really good job for a really long time, right? And this is just, I don't have any more really profound points to make about this. I feel like I still need to talk because this is such a big deal and to make sure that everyone realizes that it's a big deal, but I'm sure you all do by now. It's not a thing we can perfectly explain. It is a fascinating thing that shows up. Here we pick back up on the fast forwarding, right? We had that key point that's worth calling out, and then it's back to fast forward to Noah again, or to Lamech, who is Noah's father. So we've got a couple more. In the interest of making it worth pointing out anything about this section, we have a question as well that we have to cover, but doesn't have a lot going on. Methuselah is the oldest of all of these guys. He makes it almost 1,000 years by the reckoning, 969. So that again, if you have the theory that, they were more pure and lived longer because of that in proximity to the garden, then why is like the one at the end older than the ones at the beginning, right? Like your end guy is older, and like the guy who actually was like special in that regard in the sake of his purity and relationship with God was around. Sorry, misspoke. We don't know how long he lived in that sense. Maybe forever, maybe something else. But he was around the least long amount of time. It just seems there's no correlation between, right? Like there's just random amounts of time that the story needed to progress, right? It seems kind of like that. But at any rate, Methuselah is the oldest person to live in the Bible. And if you take this literally, then the oldest person in human history. Now we get to another difference in the pattern. You have Lamech, and then you have Noah, and then you have Lamech making additional comment on Noah, saying, "Out of the ground which the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands." So far, that's the only difference in the pattern, right? Except we're about to get into a lot more about Noah. It's basically like we're going through that same pattern with everybody. You have brief interjection with one more sentence there about what Lamech said about Noah, and then you go on and elaborate at some length about that part of the story, and then you pick right back up in your genealogies. Is kind of the structure. So we know Noah is also a big deal because he sees a variation of the form, and it seems like a bigger deal because this is not a small thing that we say he's going to do, right? This is typology of Christ, right? Like when Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden, a part of that was the curse that they're going to toil and work hard. And that's like the state of humanity outside of the garden. So if you say, here's a guy who's going to make things like they were, any things like they were before we got kicked out of the garden, that's like reversing the curse of humanity. That is a tall order. And for us, being people after Noah lived and bound to toil, we could argue that he did a poor job of that. Right? If it's just Noah was supposed to make it so people never have to toil again, well, everybody still does. So in one sense of what this is looking at least, it's wrong, which makes it even more interesting. because there's definitely a sense in which it's not wrong also. But that gets into how do we look at these things, right? And the layers and the typology become really important. And that'll be a question we should take into this story of Noah, is how does he do this thing that his father said he was going to do? And what does that look like? And how does that work? And that's the Christological typology that is so present in Noah and his story provides a really good solution to that, right? Someone doing things the way Noah does things does deliver humanity back into a state like that of the garden through something very much like the flood. And in that regard, it is very much true that the core of who Noah is and what he does becomes the thing that saves humanity from their sins. But it needs not just Noah to achieve that. It needs Jesus doing Noah-like things to really get to the true end state of what was talked about there. So we're setting up, now Noah has a lot of expectations on him from his birth and first mention. There is also some repetition of names between descendants of Cain and descendants along this line. And you're very much entitled to read that as the text is suggesting that this line is coming in and replacing and being what the line of Cain should have been. I think that probably is more persuasive than they just didn't have very many names back then and didn't have a lot of ideas, because that doesn't seem like a problem anywhere else. So there is a repetition. And that's another thing in the book of Genesis that we should look at, because it happens a lot, where you have a first pass that doesn't get there, and then you have a repetition that is righting the wrongs of the first pass, and goes better the second time around, which is so key to the idea of, well, that makes Adam and Eve and us the first pass, right? Especially like pre-Jesus, right? Like this is all that first pass. And so you see kind of inherent from the book of Genesis this idea that things fail the first time and then they happen again and they are much better. And that's good that happens. And God adjusts and brings those triumphs out of those divergences, and that is for the state that humanity is in the book of Genesis. That is a tremendously important thing to keep in mind, right? Like, it's good. Like, this is that first pass that's going to come up a little short. Noah doesn't manage to take away toil from everybody on earth, even though that was kind of the idea that would happen. But second Noah does. Adam doesn't manage to follow God's commandments and stay in the garden. Second Adam does. Eve gets tempted by the serpent and gives in and opens the door to corruption of humanity. Second Eve doesn't do that. You have firsts and seconds. We'll see it so much more in this book, often accompanied by the number 7. So it's, in that regard, it seems very much not accidental that you would have Cain and Cain's line with some of these names, and we know they didn't get it right, but here, these ones are worth focusing on. And look, some of the same names. It's a second pass. The first one didn't work out. God did it again and look, so much better. And that's the thing that God does. And that's the thing God can do in our individual lives as well, right? Like, broader picture of salvation history, by all means. But also, just because you have failed at something and done it badly doesn't mean you can't work with God and then do it right, right? Like, you might look at the state of your life and think, man, I've gone so wrong. Like, it's over already. I've already done so many stupid things. Like, what can possibly come out of this? But no, God can just, new pass, right? Start over, start fresh, new pass. It can be everything that was intended from the beginning and better besides. But you have to like follow the program for the good things to happen, right? While we're alive, it is never too late to stop failing and start succeeding. And God makes great things happen whenever we start walking with God. We see when we get to Noah's part of the genealogy right here at the end of this chapter that more than one son is named, which also happened with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. Why is that? Is it because important things pass through all of those children? No. It's because we're about to tell this story and we're setting up characters, right? We were going to tell the story of the first children born to humanity, and although Seth is the one through whom things pass, we had to tell the story of Cain and Abel, so they got named, because we were going to stop that genealogy and zoom in on that little bit and talk about it. Now we're zooming in on this section, so we also hear about Shem, Ham, and Japheth, because they're all involved sort of as well. And so we're zooming in a little bit, right? The zoomed out view that just looks at the one important one we've been doing that, and now let's really zoom in on this Noah part. So when you get more zoomed in, you see more people and you name more people. Here we set up something that over these next few verses is another one of those things that only comes up here, and really can only come up while we're still in this section that is myth. Enoch being another one of the key ones, right? If you had to zoom in more on that story, that becomes a very hard thing to have in the Bible and have everything really reconciled very well. But when it's all surrounded by myth, it can make a really fascinating and important point. You have these so-called sons of God, or Nephilim, who show up. Again, think heroes of legend, right? Some of the fathers thought maybe made connections to angels here because of how they intermingle with humanity. That seems improbable, and like it's pretty contrary to the way theology has developed since the time of the fathers and how we view angels. So I'm going to throw out there that has been thought, but it seems I have a hard time getting to that. So that's not the view we're going to take. The view that there's room for interpretation here, right? Within the umbrella of acceptable Catholic theology, there's room for interpretation. For the sake of this study, where we've landed and how we're going to treat this is basically mythical heroes of legend that may or may not have even existed as real people, like Achilles or Odysseus, right? Like, maybe some foundation in some version of history, but real people with real things that happened to them, who knows? The really interesting thing is, so you have these great heroes, they're not the ones that matter. They're not like, they're called sons of God, but what is Adam? He's not a son exactly, but he's created by God and was like God, right? Like, he was created in the image and likeness of God. how do you be more of a son of God than that? Jesus, cheating, skipping ahead, but by any means that anybody could fathom before Jesus, how does one become more of a son of God than our God than Adam? And then we know that his descendants continue that. So although they're called sons of men and these heroes are called sons of God, and we tend to think, oh, the sons of God must be a bigger deal. That's not what the story is suggesting, right? These great heroes are looking at these people in Adam's line and are like, wow, they're desirable, and are like trying to intermingle. Like they're leaving behind any of their other people and are saying these are the ones, right, that are like, this is the big deal. The relevant point here is that the order of importance is flipped from how I think we try to read this, right? We read these Nephilim and all these legends, this is the big deal, and these are the special people, and that's not it. These special people are seeing the ones we're talking about and saying, yeah, them. These are the ones. And that's meant to be setting up just how special this thing God is doing is. Which further highlights probably not angels. So for the sake of how we're looking at things here, let's just say legends there to illustrate and to highlight how important and how special God's people and what he's doing here are. The other thing we get here, as we're ratcheting down on the myth and up on the history, is we're saying, oh yeah, we've had all these people living all this time, but now we're just not going to do that anymore. That's been how everything worked for these thousands of years, and now we're done doing that, and now it's 120 years is how long people are going to live. And now, of course, everyone lives 120 years because that's what we decided. But having a cap there is some means of trying to explain and get to how did all these people live this long and now we don't anymore. Was God decided that wasn't going to happen anymore. It's maybe not worth dwelling on more than that, but it does highlight that we're moving out of this time of far distant myth and we're moving into things that are more and more practical and historical in nature. Here we get the rest of the explanation of the Nephilim, and where you see the idea that these were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown, right? It says in the text to describe who they were and to hopefully anchor that term sons of God a little bit, right? Like, I don't know that we need to go into a lot more on that. It's just stories about people doing mighty deeds in the past, floating around like, this guy did these great things. Or there were all these, our ancestors were so much mightier in war and so much, right? The stories over time build, and like John Henry definitely couldn't outwork modern steam engine equipment, right? Or even really couldn't in his time, right? But you have the story of this guy who was so mighty and fantastic at mining that he was able to, although it killed him to do it, and we glossed over that part, the strength and might of men was able to keep up with machines at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And aren't these men of old so great and strong, right? Missing the moral that it killed him and the machine was fine and could go again the next day, right? Like, it's problematic, but it's mythology, right? And also, or Johnny Appleseed, right? Our country has also some stories about George Washington, right? We have our own mythology that built up that like almost idolizes some of these figures. That is a thing that we do as humans. And so this is explaining and giving some deference to some of those legends. And at the same time saying, okay, but don't look at that. Look here. This line is what matters and not all of these other legends. It's not to give them credit and to say, weren't all of these Nephilim so great and matter too, right? They're not named. They're here to de-emphasize them rather than to hold them up and add emphasis. And that's the key takeaway we should have here isn't, oh, these things all matter so much because they're in the Bible. They're here to try to highlight how much they don't matter so that those things aren't pulling focus from what the text is telling us does matter. And that also, by the way, doesn't mean that they existed. It's because, again, it's saying, cut these off of your tree, right? These don't matter. Don't even think about or give these any concern. Look here, this guy, Noah. What about him? That matters. These other guys, but this guy, he matters. And that's what this is here for. And it's really easy to read it the opposite way. So don't do that. Focus on, as the text is telling us to, focus on Noah. This part also becomes a repeating theme. And it's the first time here, and what happens as a result of it, again, matters so much to us flawed people. There is in place, at this point in the story, no commitment from God that says he's not going to just stop the whole experiment. Say, you know what, this isn't working, like, pow, gone, done, I'll move on, I'll make a new planet, I'll make some new people, we'll start over, right? Like, we kind of take for granted that that isn't a thing that God will do, because as we'll see next time, he promises us that. But at this point, no such commitment is made, which makes this by far the most perilous instance of this for the future sake of humanity. People, as we do, are being wicked on the earth and doing evil things continually, as we do. And God is looking at that and saying, this is not what I had in mind. And it grieved him to his heart, right? Like, God is described as experiencing great emotional distress as a result of the actions of these people. If that's a reasonable way to look at how God reacts to their sins, it's a reasonable way to look at how he reacts to ours. So we shouldn't do that, right? Like, there's so many reasons not to sin, but like, this isn't God being angry, right? This is the worst conversation of, I'm not angry at you, I'm just disappointed and sad. Although then God's actions still look not unlike what someone would do in anger. It's not, later we see there's plenty of time for God to be angry. At this, he's just disappointed and sad. And is, maybe this isn't going to work. And that's worse than, I'm mad at you, but we can work through this. This is like, I've had it, maybe this doesn't work at all. Maybe, we go our separate ways, me to make another world and you into oblivion and destruction. And we just call it good, right? Which would not have worked out well for us. This is the consequence of sin, right? You get cut off from God, right? While you aren't sinning, you're capable of being close to and having a relationship with God. when you are sinning, God won't be around and stand for that, right? Like, so the more you sin, the more away from God you go. If you want to be close to God, don't sin, and you will be. If you want to not be close to God, sin, and you won't be, right? It's like, that's why if you sin, you die, right? Sin, we don't physically walk with God. So, like, the physical presence of God, other than in the Eucharist, is not something that we experience, which is why that's such a big deal, partly. So the distance is not physical, but it is still very real that sin creates distance between us and God. And a certain amount of that distance is very, very fatal. And that's what we're seeing here, right? Like, humanity has turned from God, is far away from God, and insofar as that's happened, is doomed. And God is repenting, rethinking his whole creation of humanity. Maybe is an overstatement for the sake of the story, but is a repeating motif and is theologically accurate that our sin creates distance between us and God that is incredibly perilous for us. If you want to live, you need to be close to God. So, right as things look so bleak, and God is thinking, yeah, scrap the whole thing, you have Noah, who found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Who else has walked with God? Noah, Enoch, and Adam and Eve because of the garden, right? Like, good company that he's in. Everybody else, no. That likely is a phrase that refers to a certain closeness of relationship with God, and not like they went on physical walks together now that the garden isn't around anymore. Hard to say back this far. You can interpret that as you will. He definitely is capable of having very detailed conversations with God that can include things like, for example, plans for a boat. That mean that it was like he had detailed and lengthy conversations with God. So, which we'll see, but interpret that as you will. This is also this is the first of this theme that reoccurs as well, where God's looking at everybody and is like, oh, I've had it. These people, I'm not going to do this with these people. And then there's one person that's like, well, we can try a little more. I like you. This is what I'm going for. And if you can be here, then maybe somebody else could be. So we'll give it a little bit more. We'll stick with it for a little while. And we see that through some high spots along the way. It becomes a very common pattern that you have the one high spot, and God uses that person to help and or save a lot of the others who were probably more doomed than they knew without. This is all, of course, typology of Jesus Christ, who's the one who brings all of that to fruition. But as the first instance of that, this becomes kind of uniquely important in all of the sequence of these things. It's the entry point to this, which also matters because it foreshadows the entry point to the Christian life, but that's for the next lesson. This is a big deal thing. I've said that a lot, but the early part of Genesis is dense with things that are very important for how we see the world and our place in it and our relationship with God. This is another one of those like watershed things in the Bible that we're getting into, and Noah plays a huge part in that. So for now, what we've got is Noah is sufficient to look at maybe not doing away with everybody. And he has 3 sons who are going to be somewhat story relevant as well, but not nearly as much as their dad. This has been an overview of Lesson 5 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. In the beginning, the book of Genesis. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.